Shalom. Giving honor and praise unto Yah, the creator and the maker of heaven and earth. At this time, I'm going to do a presentation, and this is concerning the dating and the timing that people speak of concerning our oppression. By our, I mean us as quote-unquote minorities / black people. This presentation is not to take away from the fact that the Chinese, East Indians, and even Europeans have been oppressed in one way or the other. However, as a man of color, as a so-called black man, I will be doing most of my presentations concerning my people. This is not racism. This is just setting the record straight. So one of the things to start this out with, brothers and sisters, and elders included, is to let it be noted and understood that this date here that we're speaking of tonight is January 29th, 2016. Many people speaking about our people's oppression date it to, generally speaking, 1619, within what happened in Jamestown, Virginia. But such, however, is not the case, even when we're speaking of what happened with our immediate ancestors in the Western Hemisphere. Some Israelites have even gone to say that the 400-year prophecy that it speaks of in the book of Genesis will culminate to the year 2019. And one of the things to be pointed out, as has been pointed out before, that even if deliverance does come in the year 2019, I'm not a prophet, but it is not according to the calendar that we are using currently in this Greco-Roman / American / Gregorian calendar that we're speaking of today. So, in light of that, I want to go into a presentation on this matter. And I'm going to be reading from a book entitled The Encyclopedia of the Middle Ages, edited by Norman Cantor. And brothers and sisters, on page 222, under Henry the Navigator, we see this in part. In 1419, his attention shifted to the coastal areas of Africa, known by the Muslim name Guinea. One of Henry's explorers, Anton Galcaves, reached the Guinean coast in 1441 and returned to Portugal with gold and slaves. His expedition increased the popularity of this enterprise and the number of volunteers. Explorers under the sponsorship of Henry discovered Senegal in 1445 and Sierra Leone in 1446. At first, the discoveries produced massive amounts of slaves. However, in 1455, Henry forbade the kidnapping of natives because slaving had produced conflicts with the Africans, leading on one occasion to the death of one of Henry's most important explorers. So I just want to sit there and have that to have been read for edification purposes. This is the gentleman pictured here. That's Henry the Navigator. Now, as we read, the dating that we have read up on was 1441, 1445, 1446, 1455. This is now the year 2016. And the dates that we were talking about already has exceeded currently over 500 years to date now. So it is thus impossible to try to take a 400-year timeline and then match it up to our people's oppression here in the West. So let that be noted and understood. I have another reference book, if you will. This is coming from a book entitled Black Cargoes, A History of the Atlantic Slave Trade by Daniel Mannix. I quote this book periodically concerning this kind of matter in dealing with slavery, and I want to read this. Nobody knows who was the first Negro slaves to reach the mainland of the New World, but he must have arrived there at an early date. Balboa. Now, Balboa, we know, was a sailor in the 16th century. Balboa had 30 Negroes with him when he discovered the Pacific. Cortez brought 300 slaves to the conquest of Mexico. So now the era that we're speaking of between Balboa and Cortez, we're talking anywhere between 1513 and 1519. So now that already dates prior to the time of 1619. By 1530, there were so many Negro slaves in Mexico that they plotted an uprising. When Pizarro was murdered by his own men in Peru, his body was carried to the cathedral by his Negroes. There were also Negroes with Alvarado when he went to Quito, Ecuador in 1534. The first Negro slaves brought to Brazil was in 1538. Now, this is something to be noted because if the black people were brought to Brazil as slaves in 1538, we can sit there and calculate it from other references that many of the slaves that was brought eventually to the mainland, that is to say to what is now currently called North America, was done also in the 17th century. So that's something to be noted and understood. All right. It goes on to say, probably the first Negro slaves to arrive on the United States mainland were imported by Lucas Valquez de Elon in 1526. So if such is the case, in 1526, which is over 400 years, how then are we taking the date from 1619? Now, let me explain something historically concerning the 1619 date. That is when a man named John Wolfe actually acquired 20 slaves from what he called in his own records a Dutch man of war in the year 1619. Of those 20 that was given in sale from the Dutch to John Wolfe, there was a gentleman by the name of Sir George Yardley who got 15 of them. So, and he used them until his death in the year 1627. So now if you take from 1627, then you got 1727, then you got 1827, then you got 1927, that's already 300 years. But we have to remember good and well that many of the slaves that was originally in what we call the North American mainland were taken from places that are in South America and places that was in the West Indies and were reshipped from there to what we call the United States of today. So that's something to be noted and understood. So I just wanted to sit there and have that pointed out for edification purposes. All right. It is impossible to try to sit there and link the 400-year prophecy that's in Genesis chapter 15 with the captivity that we're in currently, because even if you want to do those kind of years, according to that calendar, it's been over 400 years. So let that be noted and understood. Now, the 400 years is actually the 4 generations that take you from Levi and Joseph, who were brethren, all the way down to the time of the Exodus under Moses. Shalom. Have a good night.